Ladies and gentlemen, what if I was to tell you that there's an epidemic happening right now in this country? What if I told you that the sheer numbers could possibly blow your mind? Would it be a surprise to you if I explained that autism is affecting numerous kids on a daily basis in this country? The growing number of cases diagnosed every day continues to grow at a staggering amount every single year. And while the diagnosis of autism may not be a death sentence to a child, it is a dire circumstance that will affect the family and the child for the rest of his or her life. I'm fully aware of this because my child was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder when he was 3 years old. I understand firsthand the stress and the financial burdens that a diagnosis of autism brings to a family. And unfortunately, it is becoming more common in U.S. homes to either know someone with autism or have a child diagnosed with autism. Wikipedia defines autism as a disorder of neural development characterized by impaired social interaction and verbal and nonverbal communication, and by restrictive, repetitive, or stereotype behavior. Now that we understand what necessarily autism is defined as, I can begin to explain to you some of the unbelievable numbers about the growth rates and diagnosis of autism in this country. AutismSociety.org tells us that autism is the fastest growing developmental disorder in this country, growing at a rate of 1,148%. Now, that is correct. I did not make a mistake. That's 1,148%. Now, some would ask, well, how is this possible? Well, let me give you some background. In 2006, when my child was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, the statistic was, 1 out of every 110 children would be affected by autism or autism spectrum disorder. And now, the CDC and AutismSociety.org tells us that 1 in 88 children will be diagnosed or affected by autism or autism spectrum disorder. So in a matter of a very limited number of years, that statistic has increased dramatically. Now, one other interesting fact about autism is that it seems to be a little gender biased. And what I mean by that is the CDC tells us that boys are 3 to 4 times more likely to be affected by autism than girls. And while the cause or the reason for this is unknown, the numbers are the numbers. It speaks for itself. While autism affects 1 in every 88 children, autism affects 1 out of every 54 boys. Now, another interesting fact is while boys have the vast numbers of diagnosis in this country, unfortunately, girls seem to carry the burden that when diagnosed, they're much more severe cases. And also, the fact of, or the cause of this is still unknown. Now, believe it or not, with those numbers that I've given you, and a better understanding of the seriousness of these numbers, it's a little interesting to find out that autism is receiving less than 1% of research funding in this country. Now, the fact is that it's growing at a rate of 1,148%, affecting 1 out of every 88 children, 1 out of every 54 boys, and it's getting less than 1% research funding in this country than less prevalent diseases. Now, what does that lead us to do? If it's not researched, A, we can't find the cause, and B, we're unable to find the cure. So, if it's not being researched and funded by the government, that leaves it to be dealt with on a personal level in America's living rooms. The CDC gives us a statistic that states that the average family with a kid with autism or autism spectrum disorder will spend on average between $40,000 and $60,000 on top of their additional regular insurance costs for every child affected by autism or autism spectrum disorder. Now, who's got this money laying around? Unfortunately, very few. But the fact is that as a parent, you'll do whatever it takes for your kid. And unfortunately, this is the case. You'll do whatever you want that you can for your child. But this puts everybody in financial crisis, which leads to stress, which leads to divorce among parents with kids, with autism and special needs. And it's a bad situation. My personal experience was that it cost about $50,000 because insurance stated that because there was no behavior or no speech that was ever had, that my child did not lose anything, they were not responsible for it. And unfortunately, this is a generalized consensus of parents, through my personal experience, that insurance companies aren't very reliable in picking up these things. If there's just a few things that I wish that you could take away from this today, is understand that there's a dire circumstance affecting the kids of this nation. It's affecting 1 out of every 88 children, 1 out of every 54 boys, growing at a staggering rate of 1,148%, costing U.S. families in a very downed economy $40,000 to $60,000 a year per child. And it's getting less than 1% of the research funding in this country. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to find a cause and we have to find a cure because our children are counting on us to do so. I appreciate your time. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you very much. Goodbye.